in Rome, and in these commissions preparing those documents. And at the end of the preparation, in summer 1962, we will have 73 documents, so a huge pile of paper. And so we have a long preparation. Second, it's a council that mobilized a church that was as global as it never had been before. So we have that on average in the 4 sessions of the council, more or less 2,500 bishops went to Rome in every single session. To make a comparison, at the opening session of the Council of Trent, that huge moment of change in modern Catholicism, at the opening of Trent in 1545, we have at the opening 29 bishops. So 2,500 from 5 continents and 29 bishops, mostly coming from Italy. So that tells a lot. Another factor is that Vatican II doesn't, it happens because of a personal decision of the Pope, but what it has accomplished, it doesn't happen for a miracle or overnight. In a sense, Vatican II is the final moment of a 1-century-long history of the so-called movements of renewal in Catholic theology. So we have the biblical movement, the liturgical movement, the patristic revival, the ecumenical movement, and this idea fundamentally that the Catholic Church needed to go back to the early sources of the Church with this term that we usually use of ressourcement, going back to the sources. And so Vatican II is not an isolated moment. It receives a lot of ideas, of concepts, of insights from these movements that were, going under the radar for a long time in the decades before Vatican II. Another factor that makes the reception of the Second Vatican Council an event that happens during Vatican II is that Vatican II works very much like a parliament. And this is one thing that is highly, controversial in some quarters, but it's very similar. So we have a quasi-parliamentarian system. So we have commissions, sub-commissions, they work on texts. These texts are first approved by one commission, they go to the floor, and the floor debates on these documents, and they vote. And one thing that is usually forgotten, especially by people who want us to forget the importance of the Council, is that all the final documents, all the 16 documents approved by Vatican II, they were all voted with majorities between 95 and 99%. So it was not a coup d'etat. It was not a military action from the liberals, taking over Catholicism. That's a deep distortion of what happened at Vatican II. Those documents are the expression of a very long-sought moral unanimity, of a large consensus, and these texts are a product of a theological consensus. The last factor that makes Vatican II a council that receives itself during its happening is that Vatican II, for the first time, is a big event in the Catholic Church making decisions that is closely watched by the mass media. That's an undeniable thing. And so this council is not like Trent, happening in an isolated town in northern Italy, which was chosen because it was in the middle between Italy and Germany, and nobody knew what Trent had decided until a few months or years after it was accomplished. I mean, Vatican II is instantly reaching people's homes. I mean, radio, TV, the first satellites, TV programs. So we have, and the bishops voting at Vatican II, they were relying on those mass media to understand something, what was really happening. And so we have that this happens between 1960 and 1965. So it is a council that grows. If we look at what this council says, the issues debated in 1962 in the first session, and in 1965, the fourth session, we have a growth. We have different dynamics in the relationship between bishops and the Pope, between different kinds of bishops, different cultures, bishops and theologians. It's a very lively event. It's not a fossil. The second phase is what I would say happened immediately after the end of the council, the end of 1965, and the early 1970s. A few years where something very important happened. Usually, in previous history, in the history of the councils of the church, what happened usually was this, that the council decided something, and the Pope in Rome got news of what the council had decided, and the Pope in Rome decided what to make of those documents. It was a very dialectical process between the council on one side, physically, geographically on one side, and the Pope in Rome. This doesn't happen with Vatican II. It's in one place. They have fought one another for 4 years. And the major difference is this. If we go back to the Council of Trent, a few months after the end of the Council of Trent, Pope Pius IV issued a law that formally prohibited Catholics, and especially Catholic theologians, to write commentaries on the documents of the Council of Trent. Only one place and one source could say what was the real meaning of those documents, and that was the Pope in Rome. So it was formally impossible for Catholic theologians to write a commentary on those texts, also because the Pope in Rome, 1564, had created a new congregation of the Roman Curia, the congregation of the council. And so they were in charge of interpreting what Trent had decided. This doesn't happen at all for Vatican II. So these few years, 1965, early 70s, what we have is a huge amount of new books physically, or series of books, the most important series of commentaries on those documents. A few of those commentaries are still the best ones, and not because it was the 60s and so everything was better, but for one simple reason, that the authors of those commentaries, they were those theologians who had drafted those texts. So they knew what was the mind behind those lines, behind those texts. And I always give this example. I'm not famous for being a Ratzingerian theologian, but when I have to teach Dei Verbum, the document on Revelation and the Bible, the best commentary up to date is still that commentary written by Joseph Ratzinger in 1967. He knew exactly what was the meaning of that text. He had drafted that text. So And that's true for all the other documents, all the great documents. And so what's striking when we look at those commentaries is that we do not see the polarization or the division in what to make of the Second Vatican Council, which is one thing that is typical of today. So we see that in the theological production after Vatican II, we see that the moral unanimity shaped by that parliamentarian mechanism of the Council is reflected, spills over in those commentaries. So we have a church that is united or unanimous, not always in interpreting the importance of this paragraph or the other, but in understanding Vatican II as a moment of change and of something that could not be dismissed. That was a moment of great unity. Back then, it was not a big issue what has now become in the Catholic Church, often a litmus test for theologians and bishops, which is the question that sometimes I even get, from students before they decide to take my course. They ask me, are you for continuity or for discontinuity? Because if you are for continuity, I'm taking your course. Because it means that you're Catholic. If you are for discontinuity, that's not my cup of tea. That's a completely new issue in the way it has become a divisive issue. Back then, we had debates, but this issue of how continuous or discontinuous Vatican II is with the tradition, which is a silly question in these terms, was not there. We had other debates, and the most important of them was the debate on the most complicated and the longest document of the Council, the Pastoral Constitution Gaudium et Spes, on Church and Modern World. And here it's for me the most fascinating document of all, because it's between 1964-65 and in the first few years after 65, we see two streams in Catholic theology becoming two different rivers and two different ways of being a Catholic theologian. On one side, we have the so-called Neo-Augustinians, to be brief, the pessimists, the ones who say Gaudium et Spes was overly optimistic, was overly confident in the ability of modern world to accept the gospel, and overly optimistic on the ability of the church to evangelize. And they found their intellectual home in a journal that was founded in 1972, the journal Communio, which is still their voice. On the other side, we have the so-called, or what some have called, the Neo-Thomists. To be brief, the optimists. The ones who said that in modern times we should not be afraid of modernity, because we are fundamentally, we have a deep confidence in the ability of the human mind to capture reality, to get the truth out of modernity. And they were even more radical, and that's why they are called Neo-Thomists, because they said we shouldn't repeat what Thomas Aquinas said in the 13th century. We should apply his method, which was back then using non-Christian philosophers, for example. And so we should use non-Christian philosophers of our time, non-Christian sources, to understand our reality, our social issues, our cultural problems. And their voice was usually expressed in the other journal that was founded even before the end of the council in 1965, in the journal Concilium. What's interesting to know, and it's one thing that these people, they don't put on their CV, is that the same people who founded in 1972 Communio, some of them in 1965 they had founded Concilium. And that group split. And one of them was Joseph Ratzinger, who is the most important one. But to be fair, it's true that this division on Gaudium et Spes between optimists and pessimists is not exactly the same between conservatives and liberals. So you had on the skeptic side, on the pessimist side, one like Ratzinger, but also Karl Rahner, who is a very different kind of theologian. So that is an important way and moment, I think, to understand that there were issues much deeper than continuity, discontinuity. And this is where I think we should start to understand the importance of debating on the council, because back then the issue continuity, discontinuity was not idealized as it is today. It was very practical. And we see that the biggest crisis immediately after the end of the council comes with 1968 and Pope Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae. This is where we see how difficult for the Catholic Church is change. That, as we know, the major issue in Pope Paul VI's mind was, am I entitled, do I have the right to change the moral teaching of a previous Pope, under whom he had worked in the Roman Curia in the 1930s, by the way. So it was also personal for him. But I mean, back then, continuity, discontinuity was much more practical, and for Humanae Vitae is that teaching of Pope Pius XI on banning contraception for married couples is still what we need or not. And as you know, Vatican II tried to debate that issue, and Pope Paul VI withdrew that issue from the council, saying, I will come up with something after consulting theologians, which he did, but he did not accept the recommendation of the Theological Commission, as you know. So that year 68 is a very crucial year, and not only for the students, movements, but especially for Humanae Vitae. And there's a second moment in these early 70s, which is the formation of the Society of St. Pius X, the Lefebvrites, the ultra-traditionalist group who said, and they still say, that Vatican II is for them heresy, is formal heresy. So they cannot accept Vatican II, and they think that they are still Catholic, and all the others are not Catholic anymore. And so between the early 70s and 1988, a formal schism is produced, and it's a schism that has not been healed yet, despite all the efforts of Pope Benedict XVI to give them much more than any other pope before him was available to give them. But in the end, I'm grateful to the Lefebvrites, because they take Vatican II seriously. And they seem to be the last ones sometimes, because they say, we take those teachings seriously and we cannot accept them. So we don't believe you, Vatican, when you tell us that there's a way around that. We don't accept those teachings. And so this is And the second phase of the 70s, of the mid-70s, ends in 1978 with the death of Paul the Sixth, the last pope, who was a pope of the council, and the election after this very short pontificate of John Paul the First, of John Paul II, whose pontificate is very important because John Paul II is the last pope who was also a bishop of the Second Vatican Council, which is one thing that we cannot say about Joseph Ratzinger. They have two different statues in what they see in Vatican II. And the pontificate of John Paul II is very interesting if we look at this history of the reception of the Second Vatican Council, because from the early 80s, so after a couple of years, we see that John Paul needs a theologian different from him, from his theology, and he picks Joseph Ratzinger because he knew that he needed this kind of voice. As you probably know, John Paul II, when he was a bishop at the council, he was a member of the commission working at Gaudium et Spes. He was in that commission. So they knew exactly the theological differences. John Paul and Joseph Ratzinger went beyond the fact that one was Polish and the other German, which was not easy sometimes, intellectually for them. And so what's important in this very long pontificate, and when we think about the last 50 years after Vatican II, we cannot forget that half of those 50 years were under John Paul II. It's an enormously important, complicated pontificate. So, and what's interesting in that pontificate is this, that we have two theologians, two churchmen, who were a product of the Second Vatican Council theologically, but with two different ideas and perceptions and ways of implementing Vatican II. And what we have is a kind of polyphony of two different voices. And what happens is that in that pontificate, slowly, the voice of Joseph Ratzinger becomes louder. And that starts very early. So he was appointed Cardinal Prefect of the CDF, of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in 1981. And in 1985, Joseph Ratzinger publishes his manifesto, basically, the Ratzinger Report, that was a conversation, an interview with an Italian journalist, a neo-Catholic, a former Marxist neo-Catholic conservative, Vittorio Messori. And this book basically said what happened after Vatican II in these last 20 years. Many things have gone wrong. So we should pay attention and scale back some of those changes. And that book was a very carefully planned operation. It was a book that was published, if I'm correct, in 12 or 13 languages, which is, I think, it means that you have been planning that for a couple of years at least. It doesn't happen overnight. And what's interesting is the timing of that book. That book came out exactly in those weeks when the bishops from all over the world, they were gathering in Rome for the Synod of Bishops of 1985. They're gathered to discuss the 20 years after Vatican II. What's working, what's not working, and the prefect of the Holy Office intervenes with this, and the assumption or the impression is that the Ratzinger report overshadowed much of that event or influenced many bishops. Nevertheless, the Synod of 1985 is a very important moment Because in this debate between bishops, what went well, what didn't went well in these last 20 years, the idea was that Vatican II is there, and there's no way that we can belittle that event and its achievements. And if we read the final report of that synod of the bishops, we see some statements that now would seem dangerously liberal. One example, in this final report, there is the statement that we cannot separate the texts of the council from the spirit of the council, and we cannot use one against the other. And so we cannot advocate things because they are in line with what we think is the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. But in this text, there is a positive statement on the existence of a spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And it says, to understand those texts, we have to understand those cultures behind that, those intentions that are not always explicitly stated in those documents, basically because to understand the meaning of those final texts, those 16 documents, you have to know or to remember something of what happened to those texts from the early drafts of 1960, 61, 62 to the final draft, 64, 65. If we lose that perspective, we will become easily, Vatican II fundamentalists, without knowing how much change happened in one same text in a few months or in 3-4 years. And so this is, 1985 is the beginning of a new phase. So in my mind, there are two couple of decades that we can divide the reception of the Council. 1965-85, it's the first longer period where Vatican II is good. There's no doubt about that. We have to work on things. And then there is the second couple of decades, 85-2005, when we have the growing fear that Vatican II was fundamentally a mistake, or that a few things got out of hand. And this starts, in my mind, with the rise of Joseph Ratzinger as the theologian-in-chief of the Catholic Church. And we have a few documents that are a testimony of this new approach, of this more skeptical approach to the Second Vatican Council. We have a few, 1 year and a half before the Synod of 1985, we have the new Code of Canon Law, 1983, which was thought as an act of theological reception of the Council in juridical terms. So it's not a purely juridical operation. We have in 1989 the new profession of faith issued by the CDF. In 1992, we have the famous document on ecclesiology, Communionis Notio, which said basically, don't get ideas about the Catholic Church being decentralized. That's not going to happen, and that's not theologically correct. And so Communionis Notio 1992 stops a couple of theologians especially, but sends a message that there are limits to how decentralized the Catholic Church can become. In 1998, we have a very important law, a motu proprio, that says that national bishop conferences, when they want to teach something, they have to be absolutely unanimous. which can work if you are the Bishops' Conference of Malta, that are 3 or 4 bishops. If you are a big country or a normal country with 100, 200, 300 bishops, that will never happen. And in fact, it has never happened. So that has basically paralyzed the teaching activity of the National Bishop Conferences. And in the year 2000, we have the document of the CDF on the relationship between Christ, the Church, and non-Christian religions, Dominus Jesus, during the Great Jubilee. And so these are just a few moments, a few elements in this history. There is then, in 1985, Catholics and especially theologians, they realized that to understand Vatican II, they need to know more about what happened at Vatican II. So, in the late 80s, a large international group of historians and theologians, Catholic historians, Catholic theologians, they begin a series of conferences. In 1988 is the first one that ultimately led to the 5-volume History of Vatican II that was edited by my mentor, Giuseppe Alberigo, between 1995 and 2001. In 5 volumes, it has been translated in 7 languages, and so with many authors, 30 authors more or less. So it's, very international. And the idea is that we cannot interpret those texts without knowing what we had in the stage before the last draft of this document. I'll give you one example. If we read De Verbum, the Constitution on Revelation, the Bible, we might take those statements, especially today, as, I would say, obvious. You shouldn't be fundamentalist when you read the Bible, the Old Testament as a permanent value, all these things. But if you know that, for example, in the first session, 1962, a bishop on the floor of St. Peter came up with this brilliant idea that the Bible is way too complicated and way too long, so we should prepare, as a council, highlights of the Bible for the Catholic faithful, and give them just this translation of, 10% of the Bible, 20%. And that's enough for them, because it's too complicated. So, if we know that, we understand, not just how lucky we are, but how much change happened in the understanding of the Catholic Church and of the Catholic bishops of the Bible. If you know that, you will appreciate much more De Verbum, and everything, like this example, happened for every single document of the Council. And so that is a major accomplishment for not just historians, but for theologians, because that history, day-by-day history of the Second Vatican Council is not a secret anymore. So we know things. We cannot be told that this really didn't happen. We know what happened. We have used more than 100 archives, more than 100, and we polled 700 people and 700 places. And we use, first of all, the official archive of the Second Vatican Council established by Pope Paul VI in 1965. So we use the archive that they told us to use. So but this is a key point, because what happened in the early 2000s is this, that we have the completion of this 5-volume history and many other smaller books, not that difficult to approach as 5-volume. And so between 2001 and 2005, we see that the institution, the Catholic Church, and especially Rome, realizes how much we know. And we means, I mean, Catholic historians, theologians, and many lay people. Those years are exactly those years when the health of John Paul II vanishes, basically. And what happened is that with his death and the election of the new Pope in April 2005, we have reached that point when many people said, okay, this is the right occasion to stop something, to put the genius back into the bottle, basically. And so we see that the reaction in Rome, in the Vatican, towards historians and theologians working on Vatican II becomes increasingly hostile. And remember, the first volume of those 5 volumes was given to John Paul II physically, and we went there. And the first volume of those 5 volumes was favorably reviewed by the Osservatore Romano. From the second volume on, we have a series of extremely negative, harsh reviews written by non-historians, though, of course. So we see that in 2005, those change in those mentalities and the change in that pontificate has changed the whole debate on the council. In one word, now Vatican II needs advocates, needs to be defended, which is one thing that 20 years ago, 30 years ago was unthinkable. I mean, Vatican II was there. I mean, it's just for the West or for Canada, I mean, having a small group of people, I mean, advocating for the defense of the Constitution. I mean, if there's something like that, there's something very wrong that's going on. So this is, and this pontificate has been used by many people, and I believe here that Pope Benedict XVI is a Vatican II theologian. But his pontificate has been used by the entourage, by Rome, to make a case for a pope who's anti-Vatican II. And in many decisions, we don't know how much the Pope knew when he was making those decisions. And I'll give you a few examples of the distortion in the Pope's acts in these last 7 years. The famous speech that he gave to the Roman Curia on December 22nd, 2005, the famous speech on the 2 hermeneutics of the council, where the Pope said, there is the good hermeneutic of continuity and reform, and the bad hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. Now, magically, if you go on the web, I mean, blogosphere or neoconservative Catholic ideologues, you have only continuity, discontinuity. Reform has vanished. But that is an important part of that speech. And Pope Benedict hasn't paid enough attention about how his message is getting out. A second example is the motu proprio of July the 7th, 2007, 777, on the liturgical reform, when in this law it says basically that you can legitimately celebrate according to the old rite, to the preconciliar rite, which is not just Latin, is a different kind of rite. And that broke a precedent, was a new precedent that Paul VI and John Paul II, they were vehemently against, because they knew that it was a symbolic issue that would have been read as an attack against Vatican II, which is what it is, actually. And then we have, in January 2009, the lifting of the excommunication for the 4 bishops of the Lefebvrites. And the incident became a global incident when they discovered that one of those bishops was publicly saying that the Holocaust never happened, which is one thing that amazes me because we all historian theologians, we know that the Lefebvrites are a nest of anti-Semitism. It's no secret. So that was a big example of how costly can be, forgetting Vatican II. There are many things in there that cannot be easily taken out without damages. So this is a short history of what happened in these last 50 years. Now, this short second part, very short, is this. When do Catholics become divided when they hear Vatican II? And in my mind, there are three issues that are behind those documents. And the first issue is Vatican II is Vatican II the beginning or the end of the reform of the Church? Which is very close to the idea, is Vatican II an event that we should read exclusively with those texts without knowing what was debated in St. Peter? Or should we implement Vatican II as an open-ended council, as it happened for the liturgical reform? And so this is the first issue. The second issue is this: for a long time, theologians have, debated about this issue. Vatican II as a text or as a spirit. Now, the best theologians working on this, they say that it's time to look at Vatican II not just as a series of different documents, but per issues. And there are issues that are transversal to different documents, to the Church, anthropology, freedom, this kind of thing. They have to be read in different documents transversally. And this is it's, I think, what's next in the research on Vatican II in this next, decade or two. And third is this. The issue is how much change can the Catholic Church tolerate as a body, as an institution, as a community. How much change can we tolerate, or can the institutional mechanisms tolerate? And in this, I just want to mention the insight of Karl Rahner, who said Vatican II should not be read in the same way we read Vatican I, or the Council of Trent, or the Fourth Lateran Council. We should see Vatican II as the second half of what happened at the Council of Jerusalem, of which we can read in the Acts of the Apostle, chapter 15, when a small Jewish sect decided to become a world religion. And they decided that Jewish laws were going to be imposed to neo-Christians only for a very small number of laws, because Christianity needed to be available to non-Jewish. And Karl Rahner said, we are now in a similar situation when Catholicism is not anymore a European phenomenon, or an Italian phenomenon, or a European phenomenon. It's something, at Vatican II we have formally the acceptance that the gospel can be inculturated in every culture, on one side. And on the other side, there is no culture that has a monopoly on the gospel, which is one thing that is now at stake when we talk about Vatican II. And so this view of Karl Rahner about Vatican II as a Jerusalem II, basically, Council of Jerusalem II, I think it's the one that best describes the importance of the event. So now to conclude, I think that we are in a very delicate moment. Also because Vatican II is a great event in the history of the Catholic Church, but it's also a great event in the history of Christianity in general. The ecumenical repercussions of Vatican II are immense, enormous. And it's an event that has become part of the modern conscience, of how we do Catholicism as acting as part of the soul of our world. So I think that we are in a very delicate moment, and on one side I accept this way of describing the change inaugurated by Vatican II using the famous definition given by the historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, in his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In that book, Thomas Kuhn said, in science, we do not make progress by adding, small bricks. In science, change happens with, revolutions, a completely new paradigm. Einstein, a completely new way of understanding things. And for a long time, Vatican II has been described as a paradigm change. And I think that it's true. More practically, I'm inclined to see Vatican II, if you want, in medical terms. My father and my grandfather, they were physicians. So I see Vatican II as a vaccine. As a vaccine against a few typical diseases of Christianity and of religion in general. And it's a disease, accepting Vatican II is like taking a vaccine. And there is, and we know, the national health centers tell us that there is a limit of unvaccinated population beyond which we are going to get something very serious. They say it's 3% or something. And beyond that, we are going to be hit by a huge pandemic. And so Vatican II is usually taken for granted by many people, as we take for granted something like vaccinations. Of course you are vaccinated. Well, if you got that shot, you are. But if you're not, you're not. And so Vatican II is like a huge scientific revolution. And what strikes me is that we know that in history of science, a major scientific advance is almost always overestimated in the short run for its consequences and always underestimated in the long run. A vaccination. So I think that we are now, in the Catholic Church, after 50 years, we are exactly on that fence between the short run and the long run. And the highest risk that we're taking is to underestimate Vatican II, to see how helpful it has been in these last 50 years to change the church as a global church, as a church that prizes authenticity, that wants to be transparent, to be responsible. Now, I get a strange feeling sometimes when I read that Vatican II is old stuff for young Catholics, is medieval, is Middle Ages. My experience is exactly the opposite. The theology of the Second Vatican Council still works if you let those texts speak and you don't impose your ideology on what happened after. To be frank, coming from the West, if you don't read Vatican II through the lens of the culture wars, or Woodstock, or pot smoking. If you read Vatican II for what it is, Vatican II still works. there are issues there that cannot be reduced to partisan issues. Ecumenism, religious freedom, the dignity of lay ministry, they are not partisan issues. If we reduce them to partisan issues, we are in deep trouble. One thing that makes a problem for the institution is this, and there's no solution for that, I'm sorry, but is this, that we know too much about Vatican II. And that is a critical difference if we look at what happened after Trent, when for many decades not only there was an absolute monopoly on the interpretation of those texts, but nobody really knew who voted for or against one document at Trent. Now we know. We know who are the winners and the losers and why they lost. So we know that. And the institution doesn't tolerate very much people knowing what happened in secret chambers. It's this easy, but we cannot pretend that we don't know. It's an impossible thing to do, and in this, I'm optimistic because I think that the Catholic Church is much better equipped to handle the rediscovery of its past than the intellectuals on the payroll of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who, when faced with the permanent ideological manipulation of recent history, they were mocked with this popular joke, I quote, "We know exactly what the future will be. Our problem is with the past. That keeps changing." So I think that in the Catholic Church we are in a better situation, also because there are things that have become already part of Catholicism in the 5 continents. And so Vatican II just needs to be rediscovered, taught again, because it has become part of what Catholicism is today. And there are things, and the vast majority of the things that were brought about by Vatican II, they cannot be undone anymore. It has been too successful, and there are things that we still need to do. But going back is not a viable option for anybody in this Catholic Church. So, thank you very much.
Dr. Faggioli has agreed to take questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, there are microphones, one on each side here. I'll just ask you, when you go to the microphones, just to be as concise and brief and get to your point as you can, so that he has a chance to answer as many questions as possible.
Thank you very much for a very, I think, insightful and very succinct presentation. You covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, so I'm very grateful for that and the explanations that you brought with your presentation. What intrigues me is sort of in the last section of your comments where you mentioned that we know too much about Vatican II, and what struck me there was what are you implying in relationship to knowing too much? And my suspicion is in relationship to your closing comments about rediscovering Vatican II, is that we really need to, if you like, go back to the 16 texts themselves and allow them to speak without all of the political pushing and pulling that we've been exposed to, or other cultural phenomena, other political, if you like, battles that have waged since Vatican II and subsequent papacies and theologians that come and go and interpretations that come and go. So my question basically is the fact that we know too much pushing us back to the texts that are somewhat, that need to be somewhat, if you like, naked before the reader and not being overly interpreted or overly layered with all of these other things that have happened. So is that what you mean, or are you referring to something else?
So when I was saying we know too much, I mean, we never know too much, of course. I was saying we know a lot. If we compare with other moments of big change in human institutions, and institutions need to digest change with time. And so what happened in these last 50 years has been a big process of change. And in the middle, we also discovered why that change happened. So it was not just top-down, it was a process. And so this is what I meant with too much. It's an interesting question. So one of the things that I have appreciated in the speech that Pope Benedict gave on October the 12th of this year for the 50th year, he said, I mean, maybe with an intent different from mine, but he said, we should go back to those texts and we should not become too polemical in the interpretations, which of course, I mean, serves the office of Peter. I mean, it serves Rome very well, this. But in my course, for example, on Vatican II, we have a section on the different interpretations, but after the section when we study those texts for what they say. And so this is, those texts are very complex texts, are not easy ones, except maybe Nostra Aetate on non-Christian religions, which is very immediate, is very short. But the other texts, they have different, I mean, layers. So my instinct is to teach those texts, to read those texts, and to explain Catholics and students what we had before, and only in the end, the different interpretations on those texts. So if you make these 3 steps, I mean, that text, what was immediately before on ecumenism, for example, or other issues, and the debate after, so it's a kind of a dance, I mean, you go, so you have a sense of the importance of those texts, and if you do that, the whole issue, continuity, discontinuity, appears for what it is. That is a silly question, because of course Vatican II is continuous and discontinuous. They are both. But if you want to understand the importance of Vatican II, you have to understand what's new. As always in human life, I mean, if you look in those texts of the Second Vatican Council, what they say on the theology of the sacraments, apparently nothing happened, because Vatican II did not change the fundamental theology of those sacraments. But if you look at how we celebrate them, that's new. And so I understand that the institution needs continuity. We all need continuity in our life, our family, our work. I mean, but intellectually, I don't think it works. I mean, selling Catholics that is in perfect continuity with the past. I mean, if you read the document on religious freedom and on non-Christian religions, you have in the footnotes, I mean, only quotations from the Bible and very strange sources that in one of my students' paper, I will tell my student, please don't use this. Because they had nothing of the previous tradition, 19th century, 18th century, that they could use. There's nothing. There's literally nothing. And so the Pope's argument is, Well, but actually those teachings on religious freedom are in continuity with the teaching of Jesus Christ. Yes, and the 19th century is in between. It's important. So there's a continuity there. But you cannot take, 19th centuries of church history as a bad moment, as an exception. It doesn't work. So, in my view, we should reach, when we teach those texts, we should address the issues of the different interpretations just as the last moment, when you know those texts, and there are texts more important than others. So, and what was the theology before? In the end, the third step, you will understand and you will make sense of those different interpretations. It's far from easy. It's difficult, but it can be done. It can be done. It's not magic.
Massimo, earlier in your talk, you characterized or described Joseph Ratzinger's plan, or his writing of that document and multilingual versions of it, to influence the Synod of Bishops. I was wondering, would that be characterized as a power grab or as the work of the Holy Spirit?
How many hours do I have? It's a power grab for sure. Joseph Ratzinger has always been very good in having his voice heard. There's no doubt about that. He's very skeptical on modern media, on modern culture in general, but he can use them, except a few incidents, but he can use them. So so here we face one classical question that is typical for church historians. Is church history an historical discipline, or is church history a theological discipline? So if you take the approach of church history as a theological discipline, you will be inclined to say, well, that was the Holy Spirit. If you take church history, as I take it, as an historical discipline that works with a special kind of object, but cannot be blind to documents and to facts and dates and names, I'm inclined to see that in more human terms. That's a debate that is always there, and that's what the Vatican. That's why they're angry with us, because we have done the history of the Second Vatican Council, taking it in as a historical event with human actors, with letters, and with factors and players coming from very different places, like the Arab embassies in Rome asking the council not to say anything about Judaism because they didn't want a pro-Israel document approved by the Catholic bishops. Things that nobody really knew, or nobody really wanted us to know, let's say. And so this is what they tell us. You have made of the Second Vatican Council a thing of what we know too much in terms of human elements. And you have, forgotten the Holy Spirit there. I believe that the Holy Spirit was working there, but I don't think that, knowing the history makes you unable to believe that the Holy Spirit was working there. I don't see that. But these two tendencies, they tend to exclude one another. Yeah, I don't see that as mutually exclusive. That's my long or short answer. It depends.
I had a comment. You had said that at Second Vatican there were probably 2,500 representatives.
Bishops, yes.
Bishops. And so with 2,500 bishops, representative of the entire world, of many different cultures, not just many different cultures, but many different social cultures, bishops from small towns to bishops from large cities, where we have these culture wars. Some of them do, some of them don't. You have this homogeneity, this sort of togetherness, this solidarity, which was so optimistic to hear, even though that goes back to 1962. So that these values espoused here are so universal on what the church stands for. And so it's 50 years, but no doubt probably not that much has changed since then. So it's just a comment.
Yeah, one thing has changed, and it's one thing I'm very concerned about, is that Vatican II said to be a Catholic you don't need to be European anymore. Now, in these last few years, we have seen a tendency to present European Catholicism as the real deal, the complete package, the full option. And so this nostalgia for Latin, this is new. This was not there at the council. There was the idea that was expressed by the Cardinal of Bologna, and that did make him very popular, that the church needs to be poor, and poor, especially culturally poor, which means that we have no other culture as Christians than the gospel. Because cultures can become easily a huge filter to take from the gospel what you want and to leave out what you want, or to misinterpret completely. And so the Catholic Church needs to be culturally aware, but also aware that cultures work as blinds sometimes. That seems to be lost, and in some bishops and cardinals, we have now the idea that Catholicism needs to be expressed culturally. The culture wars. That was not part of the Second Vatican Council, also because back then we didn't have issues like bioethics, euthanasia, this kind of thing. Back then we didn't have that issue. So it was easier. But now for me the idea of Catholicism a culture, I mean Catholic culture, I see that as dangerous, especially in some countries where the national culture is so polarized on culture wars, and not faithful to the intention of the Second Vatican Council. I think it's very important of that event.
Thank you. I have a question about, you intrigued me by saying, is Vatican II the beginning or the end? So, I've read some theology about when, for about the first 1,000 years, priests could marry or not, and that when the church changed to say priests had to be celibate, it was really saying two things. That in order to be in this hierarchy, you either had to not be a woman, nor could you sleep with a woman, which was really very misogynistic. What do you see the chances are of the Catholic Church changing that?
In the short run, not many. But, well, it's a thing beyond doubt now, and so nobody in the Catholic Church now can say that the celibate priesthood is of divine right. It's a human decision. We have Catholic priests in the Eastern Catholic churches who are married. We have accepted, former Anglican priests. So it's a human institution that can be changed. Now, in these last few years, we have seen increasingly a push for a more clerical church, and for a model of clergy that is much more isolated and above and a sacred person. So if we are going down that road, it will not happen soon. That's for sure. I don't know when it will happen. I know that now it's an open secret that we do not need personal intervention from God telling us you can change this. It's clear that we can change this. So when, how, I'm not a wizard, so I don't know. It can be done. There's no, and quite easily, so in this, I'm optimistic, because if you consider that Catholicism has survived as a faith, as a church, has survived to centuries when being a priest, or being a bishop, being a cardinal, or being a pope had nothing to do with being a Christian. Had nothing to do with being a Christian. So we know of bishops of the 16th century, 17th century, who never celebrated Mass once in their life. It was just like being senator, being governor, being president. It's an office, okay? So now the Catholic Church, despite the scandals, is much holier than it has ever been. That's not an easy thing to say, but I strongly believe that. So in this sense, we see a progress in in what kind of church we are. It's a church where you now stay in because you believe, and not because you want to have some kind of job, or you want to get married, or you want to be a full citizen, which was exactly what was for Italy until a few decades ago. So we have changed. That kind of change that you're talking about is more difficult because it would need a reinterpretation of how the Catholic Church sees, human sexuality, priests. So I wouldn't bet my money on a quick decision on that. But we have changed a lot in these last few decades or century. We do not. So when we see a bishop or a cardinal or a pope, we assume that he's a Christian, that he believes in God, or as the Jewish philosopher said about Pope John the 23rd. Finally, we have a Christian on the throne of Peter. It's not that obvious. It's not obvious. So things have changed. Being Catholic. 80% of being Catholic is about patience. Yeah. It's this kind of church, this kind of religion, this kind of mindset, and I take it seriously because it can teach you a lot. Spiritually. Living in a church that don't always fits your cultural views. Okay, so it shouldn't, humiliate you, of course. But you live in a church that is global, and so decisions made for here might not work in Indonesia or in Africa. It's a church with a very long past and very aware of it. So in this kind of situation, change is more difficult. And we shouldn't be impatient with the church as we shouldn't be with ourselves. And there are limits, of course. So, I mean, what I do is clearly advocating for change in my job. But I see that there are limits, that there are things that cannot change overnight. If we want real change, if we want to experience excitement, yeah, that's something else. But it doesn't work. If change happens too quickly, it doesn't take roots.
Was Vatican II too much change too quickly then?
I don't think so. I don't think so. There's one argument that can be made for how quick the liturgical reform was. It happened in 1 year, but again, why did it happen in 1 year? Because they were afraid that a change in the wind could stop everything. And so they knew, let's get this done. And to be honest, the liturgical reform, the liturgical constitution, was the first document that was approved, and it's the only document of the preparation that survived the preparation. So all the others, they were completely redrafted from scratch, all the others. That constitution survived, not intact, but the key issues, in 62, 63, there's not much difference. And so that's why they felt comfortable. I mean, culturally, it was a huge change. I mean, Latin, so that can, I don't see actually, so we see much discomfort now with the liturgical reform now, with many people who never experienced the old rite. So I don't take that argument from them. Because they are looking for some stronger identity, more Roman, more European, more clerical, that has nothing to do with that happened too quickly. So I can accept, I mean, shock from people who were, I mean, teenager in 63, 64, but not from my students. With me, that doesn't work, they know. So,
I could only think, patience is not one of my virtues, so I don't know I don't know what that does to myself as a Catholic. I'll have to work on to ponder that one. But right now I'd like to invite forward Father Cornelius Mahoney, pastor of St. Michael's Church in Waterloo and Vicar of Education for the Diocese of Hamilton, to formally thank our speaker.
I know all about Christina's patience. I spent a lot of time with her in the car today, and it's not very good. Sorry, Christina. Even the president agrees. I was all of 5 years of age when the Council Fathers began their first session for the Second Vatican Council in 1962. When I celebrated my first communion in the spring of 1965, Mass was celebrated in English, and I was among the last generation in 1969 to receive a smack across the cheek when Bishop Lucy administered the sacrament of confirmation. When I was in the seminary from 1976 to 1982, several of the rites which were revised as a result of the council, including the new rite of Christian initiation of adults, were published to great excitement. In seminary, the course in canon law was a jumble of papers from several sources and the new code was not published until the year after I was ordained. And mea culpa, maximo culpa, I confess that I was an active and conscious participant in the research and development of modern religious education programs. For me, your presentation this evening, Dr. Faggioli, has been about remembering. A church confident, looking outward, embracing the new, and respectful of the old. You have reminded us that what is important is to look back at the Council as an event from 50 years ago, but it's important to think and talk about the past and the present in living color, looking back to plan forward. But your talk is also a challenge. We're a church profoundly and irreversibly changed by the Council. The world that the bishops represented at the Council from 1962 to 1965 is very different from the world that we inhabit today. In fact, a vast population that never knew the pre-Vatican II world is today the source of the Church's new life and creativity. The Council was an event in the Church's history of such epic proportions that it continues to reverberate in the lives of Roman Catholics, whether they like it or not. And it is consequent, and it consequently continues to spark controversy in how we are to interpret it. The first 50 years are not enough time to allow for a cohesive interpretation of the Council. If we are to have a lively and engaging historical and theological conversation about the Church and its future, it is essential, as you have reminded us, that we know more about the Council, because knowing more deeply nourishes one's understanding of what happened at and after the Council. Grazie mille. Thank you for your insights and provoking us to get back to the sources, the texts, and the vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Cohn. So, a couple pieces of business before we finish up this evening. First of all, I want to thank those who have given to the Ignatian Lecture Fund, which is supporting this evening's lecture. Secondly, a reminder that you can sign up in the foyer if you would like to receive the latest information about this series, and that would include receiving emails, reminders about upcoming speakers. Every year, St. Jerome's University, since 1982, has been pleased to present a provocative program of speakers to our community. And we're able to do so at no charge to you, thanks to generosity from partners and supporters. And so if you would like to support these lectures, there are donation envelopes available on some of the chairs and in the foyer. And I want to keep saying thank you so much to all who have given generously to us. There are a number of wonderful, fairly traded products available for sale in the foyer by our Social Justice Committee, and that's a great thing to think about if you're looking for stocking stuffers, which of course is what we can say in December. Wordsworth Books is also in the foyer with wonderful books, including Dr. Faggioli's book on Vatican II, and he's willing to sign copies if you'd like that. And of course there are other wonderful books there, some about Vatican II and about other themes in our series this year. Finally, our next lecture will be on Friday, February the 8th. Dr. Michael Higgins and Kevin Burns will be here to talk about their book and their three-part CBC Ideas series on Henry Nouwen. In that February 8th talk, they will take us inside the biography and the accomplishments of Henry Nouwen, this charismatic teacher, this gifted writer. And they will share with us their insights into his important history and this figure in contemporary spirituality. So I hope that you will join us for what we can, those of us who know Michael Higgins and Kevin Burns, we can be sure will be a spirited and provocative talk. So I want to thank you again for coming this evening. I wish you and your families many blessings and much joy as you celebrate this Advent and Christmas seasons. Please have a safe trip home this evening. Until next time, good night.